Hi guys, welcome back to Fairies Tutorials. In today's episode, we'll be looking at food, nutrition, and health, and we'll be exploring the microorganisms that contaminates food. Stay tuned. Section 4, Food Science and Technology. And in today's session, we're exploring content 4, which has to do with microorganisms that contaminate food. Now, let's take a look at our focus points. So we'll be looking at some definition for key concepts. We'll be exploring 3 types of microorganisms that contaminates food, which are bacteria, yeast, and mold. We'll be describing these microorganisms and also explain how they contaminate food. Now, let us look at your learning target. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to identify the microorganisms that contaminate food and also explain how microorganisms contaminate food. Now, let's kick things off with setting our foundation. And in today's foundation, we're looking at 5 key terms. They are microorganisms, contamination, cross-contamination, food contamination, and also foodborne illness. Now, I know that you're able to probably define all of these key concepts, but just in case we need a little sharpen up, let us look at these definitions. So the first one we're starting off with is microorganisms, right? Now, microorganisms refers to microscopic living organisms such as bacteria, molds, and fungus that can be seen only with a microscope, right? And on the right of your screen, you're seeing some evidence of what physical change that is taken there. So we know that the food has been invaded and they are now contaminated or spoiled, right? Now, our next term is contamination. Now, contamination refers to the undesired occurrence of harmful microorganisms or substances in food. Next term, cross-contamination, the transfer of harmful bacteria from one food to another, or also from one hands to the food, right? So cross-contamination is transferring harmful bacteria or harmful microorganisms from one source to another, right? All right, now let us look at food contamination. Food contamination refers to the presence of harmful chemicals and microorganisms in food which can cause consumer illness or death. And finally, we're looking at foodborne illnesses, and these are illnesses that are caused by pathogenic bacteria transmitted to humans by food. So microorganisms or sicknesses or illnesses that are caused by pathogenic bacteria. And when we speak of pathogenic bacteria, we're talking about the harmful bacteria transmitted to human by food. All right. Now, let us now look at the conditions that are necessary for microorganisms to grow. So microorganisms need conditions to survive and reproduce, and these can include temperature, right? So when there's an ideal temperature for microorganisms to produce, we speak of the temperature danger zone, and this is room temperature where they reproduce rapidly. We also speak of moisture, food, time, oxygen in some cases, and also an ideal pH level, right? Now, most microorganisms will need warmth, moisture, food, and time to reproduce. Now let's dig a little deeper, and now we're looking at microbial contamination. So yeast, mold, and bacteria are the microbes that cause food spoilage. Food at the optimum temperature is the ideal place for microorganisms to grow. So in order for food microorganisms to contaminate food, they have to be introduced, whether it be a means of cross-contamination, or it may be a case of unhygienic surrounding or poor food handling. Because remember, certain uncooked meat naturally have microorganisms. So for example, in the case of a raw chicken with salmonella, right? So yeast and mold spoil the outside of food and can be seen. So looking at some fruits, you may see those white strands, or looking at some bread, you may see white or grayish strands as well, right? Those are yeast, those are mold, right? Now, yeast and mold are very much similar. We could say that they're sisters, right? Or they're cousins, right? Because they're from the fungus family. And looking at them, they look similar, but the yeast will have like whiter substances on the food, whereas the mold may vary in color. So it may look like a little greenish, brownish color there, right? So bacteria cause spoilage by making toxins in food which are not visible. So whereas we can see that the food, physically see that yeast or mold may be on the food based on the particles that we're seeing, with bacteria we cannot see because they are not, even though the meat may be contaminated because it has been in room temperature for extended amount of time. So we speak about time and temperature abuse there. You know that it may be contaminated, but persons may not know until they have consumed the contaminated product, because even though we cooked, not all microorganisms will die. Good. And sometimes even if the microorganisms die by the heat, they release toxins that's already in the food that we can't get rid of. So when we eat it, we'll still get sick, right? Now, let's now look at the description of yeast, right? So yeast belong to the fungus family and form a group of single-celled organisms that reproduce by a process known as budding. Now, what is budding? Budding is when a single organism divides into two separate but identical entities. So they look the same, but they are dividing, right? And that happens as it relates to the yeast through the process of budding. Now, you may ask, how does yeast contaminate food? Yeast require what? Organic host. So when we speak of organic host, we're talking about the natural sources, right? So they require organic host to derive nutrition and have the ability to break down carbohydrates and cause fermentation. So as a result, you may find out that most foods that are affected by yeast are rich in carbs. So it may be the sugary carbs. So we speak of even like the maltose, the sucrose, lactose, because of the lactose that is found in like even say cow's milk, right? Now, as a result, most yeast spoilage is detectable as an off flavor or through fermentation, resulting in gas production in low pH. So whenever you pull something, you may hear that little gas sound releasing, right? Now, high sugar and other easily metabolized carbon food and beverages are good sources for yeast to perform at its optimum best, right? So we have to try and avoid those. Now, let us look at the description of mold. And as you can see, guys, let's go back to this picture here a bit. For the food item that is contaminated, that yeast contaminates, it mostly have that whitish strand that you're seeing there, versus on the other side where you may see with the mold with the greenish color look. So they look similar, but it's the color of the physical change that you're seeing that makes the difference. So you know which one is the yeast from which one is the mold, right? Now, molds are fungi which grow as filaments in food. So we speak of filaments, we speak of like strands, right? They reproduce by producing spores in fruiting bodies which can be seen on the surface of food. These fruiting bodies sometimes look like round, furry, blue-colored growths. Example, mold on bread. And as you can see, the mold there on the bread in the picture below, right? At the strawberry at the top, that looks like a combination of both yeast and mold that is affecting that particular strawberry. Now, some molds can be seen by the naked eye. For example, as you see in there with the bread, molds often occur if food is stored at the wrong temperature. So we speak of time and temperature abuse there, right? We also speak of high humidity. That means what? Moisture is being introduced there or beyond its recommended shelf life. So persons may buy, like I'll say, a fresh bread from the bakery that is warm, and they tie it in the bag, and they're wondering, how is it that this fresh bread spoils so easily? Guess what, guys? Remember, the bread is warm. It also have moisture, so it provides the ideal. And then if you take a time to reduce the humidity that is in that bag, then by the time you know it, you have microorganisms there starting to contaminate or start to reproduce. All right. Now, let us look at how does mold contaminate food. So tiny mold spores are all around us in the air, right? Let's just put that out there. But it's not as much as to we won't be harmed by it, right? Just to be clear. Now, it depends on the amount, then we won't be harmed, right? So once a spore lands on a surface, it searches for water and nutrients to feed off. So if the moisture is right and the food, of course, the food product, then they will get the nutrient from there. So food is able to grow mold easily because it is often kept in the perfect environment to foster mold growth. Factors such as temperature, air, and food itself provides nutrients and water the mold needs to grow, right? So in order to prevent these things from happening, we have to think about the ideal temperature, the ideal conditions that are needed to foster the growth of these microorganisms. And even let's look back to food preservation. So that is why you may have food preservation methods that are based off dehydration, right? So they're thinking about what microorganisms need to reproduce and to spoil food and trying to take away those ideal conditions, right? So we may speak of dehydration. We may also speak of freezing, cold storage, refrigeration. So those would retard the growth of microorganisms because the food products wouldn't be out in the temperature danger zone, right? We look at things such as adding salt, household chemical preservatives such as salt, vinegar. As you know that an ideal pH is also needed for microorganisms to reproduce. So if we add vinegar and create a pH that is, say, acidic, then microorganisms cannot reproduce like that. So that is why there is like pickled vegetables. Good. Now, as the spore takes root, it begins to spread, and create more spores and spread quickly on the surface of the food. Some molds can take over your food in a matter of 12 to 24 hours, while others may take weeks. So you buy the bread, you have it there for 2 weeks and you're wondering, how is it that the bread is not going bad? But in truth and in fact, there may be mold there may be spores there that you cannot see with the naked eye. And depending on the type of the bread too, remember the color of the mold or the color of the yeast, sometimes you have to look very carefully because it may not be evident as what you're seeing here on your right hand side with the image with this bread. All right, now let us move on to bacteria. Good. So these are single-celled microorganisms. They cannot be seen by the naked eye, which are present naturally in the environment as well. Good. There are many different kinds. Some are useful, as we get example in the production of yogurt, right? And some are harmful, so we call them pathogenic, right? So the presence of bacteria in food can lead to digestive upset. So persons may start feeling cramps in their stomach. There may be diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, fatigue. All of those are signs and symptoms of persons who may have food poisoning or have a foodborne illness, right? So some bacteria produce toxins which can lead to this also. Spores can also be produced by some bacteria, leading to toxins being produced. So whenever we consume a food that the bacteria release toxin on, then we get what? Food intoxications, right? So we eat the food with the toxins that were left there by the bacteria. All right, good. Now, how does bacteria contaminate food? Bacterial cross-contamination may be defined as a transfer of harmful or pathogenic bacteria from one item, food or surface, to the food, right? Now, direct cross-contamination occurs in food when there is direct contact between the source of bacteria and the food. So let us look at these examples. So examples of direct cross-contamination include raw meat stored above or in contact with cooked meat, right? Raw chicken stored above or in contact with coleslaw. So remember that coleslaw is a ready to eat item. So you would just eat it later because it's already prepared. Now, when we have the raw chicken stored above and then the chicken start to thaw and it start to drain, then guess what? It drains into the coleslaw, it becomes contaminated, and then person will eat it. Guess what? They become sick as well. Now, food handlers sneezing or coughing onto food can also be a source of contamination. Good. All right. Now, let us look at how does bacteria contaminate food. So we speak of indirect cross-contamination. This occurs when harmful bacteria are transferred from one source to the food via a vehicle, right? And when we speak of a vehicle, we're not just talking about a car, but it can be a different method, such as using the same knife to chop or slice raw meat and then using it on cooked meat without washing it and even disinfecting in between tasks, right? Using the same cloth to wash down the raw food preparation area and then the cooked preparation area, right? That's how bacteria can contaminate food items, right? Also, touching food after blowing nose without washing hands first. And right here you're seeing are some examples of bacteria and the types of food that they may be found in, and also the symptoms and of these particular food again. All right, and how it gets in the food. All right, so let us look at the first example here. And the first example here we're seeing is salmonella, right? Let me small up that for you, right? So salmonella, and foods which it is found in are, say, raw eggs, chicken, dairy food, salad dressings, etc., right? Now, symptoms of food poisoning: severe abdominal pain, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting. How does it get into food? So contamination from raw foods, dirty water, pests, or even people transporting these, right? So that is why it is very important for us to even cook at the correct temperature, so we can even kill and prevent these bacteria from contaminating food. So we have quite a big list here. You can take note. We have listeria that affects coleslaw. Most of the signs and the symptoms of foodborne illnesses are very much the same or similar, right? And in severe cases, guys, there is even death, right? There's E. coli as well that affects cooked foods, milk, seafood, salads. There is also Cholestrum perfringens, which affects meat and meat products, poultry gravies, and stews. All right, and we have how these particular bacteria can get into food items as well. All right, now it's time for your activity. Name 3 microorganisms that contaminate food. Now, when we're speaking about 3 microorganisms, if you see this question, guys, do not list the different types of bacteria. So even though those are they would also classify as microorganisms, it is best if you have yeast, mold, and bacteria, right? Now, if in the event it asks you which type of bacteria can be found in like raw chicken or undercooked meat or so forth, then for example, then you may have salmonella there. But don't list the different types of bacteria. When it asks for list 3 microorganisms, list the different categories. So we speak of mold, yeast, and bacteria. Good. From the microorganisms named above, explain how one contaminates food. So if you list bacteria, then you're going to explain how does bacteria contaminate food. And we just look at those extensively, so you should be able to answer these questions. You are awesome. You've made it to the end of the video. Please remember to like, subscribe, turn on your post notification bells so you can be notified when there's another tutorial. Thank you for making it Fairy's Tutorials.